When Sultan Murad I was killed at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, chaos could have torn the Ottoman Empire apart, but fate had already chosen his successor. On the very battlefield soaked in blood, his son Bayezid was crowned sultan. He acted fast, ruthlessly. He had his brother strangled to prevent any challenge to the throne. That moment defined him, quick, bold, and unforgiving. Bayezid's leadership style was forged in fire. Known as Yildirim, meaning the Thunderbolt, his reputation wasn't just about how fast he moved in battle. It was how quickly he made decisions, how swiftly he punished rebellion, and how firmly he ruled his lands. One of Bayezid's first goals was to consolidate power. The empire had grown rapidly under Murad, but many regions still acted semi-independent. Local rulers, tribal leaders, and Balkan princes paid lip service to Ottoman authority, but did not fear it. Bayezid changed that. He sent clear messages: obey or face destruction. In Anatolia, he turned his attention to the Turkish beyliks, small principalities that had broken away after the fall of the Seljuks. Many of them thought the Ottomans would leave them alone. They were wrong. Bayezid launched a swift campaign and forcibly annexed key beyliks including Jermian, Karaman, Aydin, and Saruhan. Some surrendered. Others resisted and were crushed. He didn't just conquer, he reorganized. In each region he took, Bayezid replaced local commanders with loyal Ottoman administrators. He built roads, fortresses, and mosques. His goal was not temporary rule. He wanted long-term control. Bayezid understood something many leaders missed. You can't build an empire on fear alone. You need structure. He worked closely with scholars, judges, and architects. He respected Islamic law and made it part of the empire's governance. He wasn't just a sword. He was a builder of systems. In the Balkans, he took a different but equally powerful approach. Christian rulers who submitted were allowed to rule as vassals, paying tribute and providing troops. But rebellion was not tolerated. When the Serbs tried to rise again after Kosovo, Bayezid struck hard. He defeated them in 1390 and married a Serbian princess, securing loyalty through diplomacy as well as fear. Bayezid's rule wasn't just about fighting. It was about centralization. Before him, the empire was a patchwork of alliances. After him, it was a more unified machine, with him at the center. He introduced standardized tax systems. He gave more power to the Janissaries, the elite infantry formed from Christian boys converted to Islam. They were loyal only to the Sultan. They became Bayezid's personal storm and a symbol of his authority. Religious scholars supported him, seeing his expansion as a holy mission. The common people respected him for bringing stability. Traders benefited from the security his rule offered across Anatolia and the Balkans. But not everyone was happy. Some Turkish leaders accused him of favoring non-Turks. Balkan nobles feared his unpredictable nature. Even his allies knew one mistake could bring his wrath. Bayezid's personality was as sharp as his sword. He was known for being fierce in punishment, but also generous to the loyal. He rewarded his generals handsomely. He gave land to soldiers who served well. His leadership was not democratic, it was absolute. But it was effective. His consolidation of territory wasn't limited to land. He tightened control of trade routes, especially those leading from the Black Sea through Anatolia into Europe. He imposed taxes on caravans and protected merchants. His empire began to benefit from wealth as well as conquest. By the early 1390s, Bayezid had turned a fragile collection of provinces into a disciplined, feared, and centralized state. But his ambitions didn't stop there. In 1394, he laid siege to Constantinople, the crown jewel of Eastern Christendom. Though the city held out, the siege sent a clear message. The Ottomans were not a temporary threat. They were now the dominant power in the region. But such expansion brought enemies. Bayezid's consolidation angered not just Christian Europe, but also rival Muslim powers, especially Timur, the rising warlord of Central Asia. Letters were exchanged. Insults followed. But for now, Bayezid remained focused on the West. His centralization methods were ruthless, yes, but they worked. The Ottoman state was no longer a battlefield alliance. It was becoming a professional, bureaucratic, and religiously infused empire. Bayezid didn't just sit on a throne. He moved constantly, inspecting borders, meeting with governors, planning campaigns. His leadership was not distant. It was hands-on, sometimes with the pen, often with the sword. He ordered new Friday sermons across the empire to include his name. His presence was everywhere, on coins, in prayers, in fear. This was how he ruled, with vision, speed, and absolute certainty. But power comes with weight. As Bayezid's empire grew, so did the pressure. The vassals in the Balkans grew restless. Christian Europe plotted a response. And in the east, Timur's shadow crept closer. Bayezid had built an empire on bold decisions and fast actions. But would that same leadership style work when the enemy wasn't just across the river, but rising from the other side of the world? By the late 1390s, Bayezid I stood at the peak of his power. His enemies feared him. His allies obeyed him. His empire stretched from deep Anatolia to the heart of the Balkans. Few dared question his authority. He was no longer just a ruler. He was the architect of an Ottoman state that now breathed discipline, order, and fear. But Bayezid was not content. His appetite for control had only grown. He now turned his eyes toward complete domination. The Christian world had seen his power at Nicopolis in 1396. He had crushed a massive European crusade and left their knights scattered like broken armor on the Danube's shore. That victory only fed his confidence. He returned from Nicopolis not just as a victor, but as a man who believed nothing could stand in his way. He tightened his grip on vassal states. Kings who once saw him as a partner were now treated as subordinates. He demanded more tribute, more soldiers, more loyalty. Inside the empire, his system continued to evolve. He expanded the power of central officials, reduced the independence of local governors, and relied heavily on his janissary corps, the backbone of his military and the soul of his regime. He pushed for more Islamic law integration, bringing judges and scholars closer to the imperial court. His rule became more structured, more religious, and more centralized. Every decision, every order, passed through Bayezid's absolute control. Even within his family, Bayezid held the reins tightly. He assigned his sons to govern provinces, not to share power, but to keep them watched and tested. He knew the threat of civil war lingered in every dynasty. So he prepared, not for peace, but for survival. But while Bayezid looked west, another power was moving in the east. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, had built a terrifying empire across Central Asia. He defeated Mongol remnants, crushed Delhi, and turned Persia into ashes. His empire moved like fire, swift, consuming, and merciless. Timur viewed Bayezid's expansion as a challenge. Bayezid viewed Timur's dominance as a threat. Letters were exchanged, then came insults, then came provocations. It was no longer diplomacy. It was pride against pride. The real tension came from eastern Anatolia. Bayezid had annexed several Turkish beyliks that Timur claimed as part of his own sphere. When the beylik rulers fled to Timur, Bayezid refused to hand them back. It was the final insult. In 1400, Timur crossed into Ottoman territory. He burned cities, took castles, and made his presence known. Bayezid, still thinking like a conqueror, rushed to respond. But this time, it wasn't a fractured crusader army he was facing. It was Timur, a man with battlefield genius and no fear of Bayezid's titles. Bayezid gathered his forces quickly. He pulled troops from the Balkans, leaving his western border exposed. He called upon vassals and allies. He was preparing not just for a battle, but for a clash of civilizations. In July 1402, the two empires met at the Battle of Ankara. Bayezid's army was massive, but tired, mismatched. Some of his own troops, especially the recently annexed beylik soldiers, were unreliable. Timur's army, in contrast, was fresh, strategic, and had elephants brought from India. It was a different kind of war. Timur used deception and terrain brilliantly. He cut off Bayezid's access to water. He confused his formations. Worst of all, during the battle, some of Bayezid's troops defected mid-fight, switching sides and exposing the Ottoman flanks. What began as a bold stand turned into a chaotic retreat. Bayezid was captured. His son Mustafa was taken prisoner. The Sultan of the Ottomans, the Thunderbolt himself, now sat in chains. The empire trembled. With Bayezid gone, his sons began fighting each other for the throne. The Ottoman interregnum had begun, a civil war that would last more than a decade. Provinces broke away. Allies turned their backs. The empire that Bayezid had unified with such force was now unraveling. Bayezid died in captivity less than a year later. Some say it was suicide. Others say it was illness. What's certain is that the man who once terrified Europe died far from his palace, his army, and his dream. But even in defeat, Bayezid's legacy endured. His centralized structure, though shaken, was not erased. His military reforms, janissary corps, tax system, and legal framework were picked up by later sultans. The son who eventually won the civil war, Mehmed Çelebi, rebuilt the empire using the very tools Bayezid had created. Bayezid's leadership style, swift, strategic, and absolute, reshaped the Ottomans forever. He wasn't perfect. His pride blinded him. His ambitions led to dangerous overreach. But he gave the Ottomans the structure of an empire. Before Bayezid, they were a strong state. After Bayezid, they were a rising imperial force. His fall was sudden, but his contributions were lasting. His reign was not just about war, but about organization, centralization, and vision. He made decisions quickly, ruled with strength, and demanded loyalty. And though he died in defeat, his name still echoes through history. Bayezid was not the conqueror of Constantinople, but without him, that conquest may never have happened. He laid the groundwork. He taught the empire to think bigger, move faster, and rule with certainty. His leadership style was not soft, it was not forgiving, but it was effective. And in the pages of history, sometimes thunder doesn't last, but it always leaves its mark.